Welcome, everyone, to another great episode of Scott Talk. Today we have Christopher P. Hilton. He's an author and he wrote a book called The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. And we're going to get into that. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Hey, Scott, thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor and a privilege. Always fun to talk with other fans.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You're very welcome. I want to get into why you wrote this book, but let's go into a little bit of background and history on you. Who is Christopher P. Hilton?
Oh, gosh, for the purposes of this discussion,
Yeah,
I'm probably just simply a hair metal Uber fan. For better or worse, this is what I've been living and breathing for the past 35 years or so. It's really my only hobby, my only passion. Call me crazy, fair enough. But it's something I've always been really into and followed closely. Most people wake up in the morning and they pick up their phone and they check the weather, they check the news sites. I check the music boards, right? So
right.
again, I don't know what's wrong with me, but this is what I live and breathe. So happy to write this book and hopefully it's fun for other fans.
Definitely. And I like the way you went about the book and how you kind of chronicled the years, okay? From like 80 to 91, and then that was it was 86 to 91 was the rise, right? And
Yes.
then and and you kind of lead up to that because you started in about 1980 to 82. So you kind of lead up to the hair metal, for lack of a better term, the whole thing that happened, and then you cover the fall and then the rebirth. So we're going to get into it. Now, with in the book, you list fans in certain categories. There's 4 categories. Can you tell us what they are?
Yeah, certainly. It kind of starts with the term hair metal. Like you said, I saw you hit on it there, right? And we were going to get to it at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah,
This is a polarizing term, as I'm sure anyone who's listening knows, as I'm sure yourself knows. For those who've read the book, the very first chapter, very first sentence says, I have a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal, which is kind of ironic because why would I use this idiom as the title of the book and reference it so many times if I hate the term? And, it's really a love-hate relationship. Hair metal can mean different things to different people. Most casual fans, they might be surprised to know that the term hair metal wasn't even invented until years after the genre's heyday. You just mentioned 1986 and 1991, where generally the music was most popular. But up until that point, I mean, nobody said the word hair metal. It was all heavy metal mostly.
yeah,
Believe it or not, in hindsight, people can't believe this today, but in 1989, bands like Poison and Warrant were heavy metal. Right? How can this be? But
yeah,
the hair metal as a term wasn't invented really until after grunge, kind of the mid to late 90s. People wanted a more disparaging, pejorative term. And this to them implied that the genre wasn't credible or wasn't about the music, or it was more about hair and style and, didn't have any substance. And so, of course, bands and fans hated this because for the most part, it's just not true. Certainly there were some bands that leaned in that direction, but these were the exceptions. For the most part, these were highly skilled musicians. The music was probably much harder to play and sing than grunge. You take a guy like CeCe DeVille, right, Poison's guitarist, kind of the signature goofball for the hair metal poster boys. CeCe DeVille was classically trained under Isaac Perlman, or a band like Winger. These are classically trained musicians. Even a song like 17, which can seem, overtly silly if you just listen to the lyrics. I mean, from a musician standpoint, that's a tough song to play, right? That's fairly intricate composition.
yeah,
But hey, like it or not, over the years, we're 30 years later, hair metal as a term has come to be really the universal identifier of this kind of music. It's clear to the audience. And that's really what I wanted to do with the book, and the title is be clear to people about what we're writing about here. And for the most part, again, we can like it, we can hate it. It's kind of like Hair Nation on XM radio. You know what you're going to get when people say hair metal. You're going to get Motley Crue, Poison, Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, Warrant, Whitesnake, Bon Jovi, Rat, etc. I could have used the term glam metal, but then people might have thought, well, maybe the book's about Alice Cooper or the New York Dolls or, David Bowie.
right.
I could have used heavy metal, but then people might be looking for Metallica or Megadeth or Testament. Or maybe I could have used the more, widely accepted 80s hard rock, but that can be anything.
Yeah.
So, I kind of was begrudgingly using this term because I've talked to dozens of people who won't touch the book with a 10-foot pole because how dare I refer to their band as hair metal, right?
Right.
And certainly I hate the term for anyone that uses it as a disparaging term, but to a certain extent, among a lot of people, it's evolved as more of like kind of a happy, nostalgic type of term, right? And people have generally shed the negative connotations with it to a large extent. So, I kind of have to forgive the heroes of the text, who are going to take offense to the term, but really it was just about clarity. You mentioned what kind of fans, and I think you talked about the 4 groups that I put together. You
Yeah.
know, there's this endless debate about which bands are and which bands aren't hair metal, right? I mean, countless discussions, very spirited discussions have been had about this.
Yeah.
And it really just depends on where you fall on the scale of hardcore fan or casual fan. And, on any given day, I can get up on the stand and make a defense for any of them, but it's kind of a spectrum. The first group is kind of, these are the most casual fans who were never really into the genre, but they're aware of it. They kind of think, well, every band with long hair in the 80s was hair metal. That's it. If you had long hair, you were hair metal, right? Which is awful.
Right. Right.
And then there's a second group who is slightly more discerning, right? They say, okay, everything 80s hard rock was hair metal except for like the true thrash or real heavy metal bands. Again, these are your Metallicas, Slayers, Megadeth. So that's the first group that kind of gets carved out.
Okay.
And that's really what the book does. The book says really, hey, I'm going to try and cover everything but these truly heavy metal bands because I really wanted to, term and appropriateness aside, get a large view on all of the bands that contributed to all the great music, no matter what category you put them in. But then there's a third and a fourth group, right? And the third group starts to get a little dicey, right? It's a more restrictive taxonomy. Usually the first bands that get thrown out of hair metal in this group are, understandably, usually Van Halen and Aerosmith, right? And this is understandable. Van Halen and Aerosmith were really 70s bands. Of course, they did hair metal-ish things in the 80s.
Right.
Often Guns N' Roses gets thrown out of this group because people will say they're too real or too authentic. I mean, good arguments, right? I mean, I could defend this all day long.
Right.
They'll throw Def Leppard out of this group a lot of times, and there's a lot of credence to that, right? Def Leppard was really a part of the new wave of British heavy metal, and they were busy off in Holland in the mid 80s creating hysteria, not on the Sunset Strip. But at the same time, I kind of acknowledge that when people hear Pour Some Sugar on Me, it's hard not to think hair metal, right?
Yeah.
Don't tell Elliot that. He'll never speak to me or anybody else again. It's the fourth group that's really interesting, right? This group can conjure all kinds of defenses as to why these bands can't possibly be hair metal. And I can be in this group if you ask me to in any given minute and any given day. But the arguments you can hear in this group are, Skid Row, okay, well, they're not hair metal, they were too heavy. Or Whitesnake, they were really a late 70s or an 80s blues rock band. Or Winger was more like a prog rock band in disguise. Where they'll look at someone like Faster Pussycat or LA Guns and say, okay, that's more sleaze metal. Okay, White Lion, well, that's, they were too political to be hair metal because they have songs like, When the Children Cry and Cry for Freedom. Warrant, they'll tell you that, well, they were only hair metal on their first 2 albums, which, was pretty much true. Mr. Big, they'll tell you was too talented, or 70s rock was really Tesla, or Cinderella was just a blues rock band that just managed to take a bad picture on their debut album. Even Motley Crue, they'll tell you, well, that was just their own entity, which is almost entirely true.
Yeah.
And so these are all, great arguments, all differences of opinion aside. There's really only a few bands that almost everybody, rightly or wrongly, considers like 100% pure hair metal. Poison, Quiet Riot, Rat, Kix, some of the bands in the later parts of the era, Steelheart, Firehouse, Trickster, Danger Danger, even Bon Jovi. But there's compelling elements where even Bon Jovi shouldn't be included. And mostly that centers on partitioning the band into the work they did in the 80s and the work they did after the 80s.
Right.
So, again, long answer to your short question, but trust me, if you want to spark up a spirited argument with any fan, drop the term hair metal and then start to talk about which bands you think are and aren't hair metal, because people can get pretty defensive.
Yeah, it's just it's a terrible term,
It is.
and no one likes it, but it is very descriptive, when you say hair metal or glam even, people pretty much know what you're talking about. And like you said, the main 5 groups will pop in their head, Poison, Motley Crue, blah blah blah. So let's get into 1980 to 82. Some of the bands that came out some of the records that came out. Van Halen, Fair Warning, came out in 81. Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love, 81. And Van Halen again, Women and Children First in 80. Wow, that's pretty quick. Yeah, so talking with Donnie V from Enough's Enough.
I saw that, yes.
And he said Van Halen had a lot to do with what we call hair metal because of David Lee Roth, where Donnie was saying Van Halen was, kind of the hardcore rock band, but David Lee Roth was the glam part of it. He had the big blonde hair and the outfits, and he was jumping all around. And he thinks that's kind of how part of it got, not all of it, obviously, but so you had like that mix of rock, the harder rock with Van Halen, and then you had David Lee Roth as the front man. And I think
he's not wrong.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion about, where did hair metal get its start or who started it? And of course, it's not black and white.
Yeah.
The elements of hair metal started really in the 70s, with things like what David Bowie and
Right.
Kiss and Alice Cooper and Aerosmith and Hanoi Rocks, or really even early Cheap Trick, or as far back as Led Zeppelin. You can trace the origins of this. But Van Halen, in 1978, absolutely, right? In a lot of ways, this was the blueprint.
Yeah.
The big flashy virtuoso guitar player, right? I mean, 99 out of 100, 999 out of 1,000 of the rock bands in the 80s are going to cite Eddie Van Halen as an influence.
Yeah.
The fact that they took some heavy riffs and some aggressive music and turned it into really music with melody and music that could be pop accessible and have really a party rock element. At the end of the day, that's really what hair metal was. It took these aggressive stylings of heavy metal and added some commercial, melodic hooks and pop catchiness to it, and made it more accessible to the general public. And certainly, David Lee Roth, if he's not the model that which every frontman was pseudo proxied on, I don't know who is, in terms of, the big charismatic frontman, and to your point, the flash and the really the band leader and the ringleader. So Van Halen was definitely a big part of the blueprint. You mentioned, of course, Motley Crue's landmark album, Too Fast for Love. A lot of what Motley Crue was doing early in their career was stuff people hadn't exactly heard before. The guitar tone on that album, or the guitar tone even more aggressive on Shout at the Devil. Shout at the Devil was just leagues ahead of what people were doing on the Sunset Strip at the time. And then, of course, as you think about how the genre broke into the commercial mainstream, you have to look to Quiet Riot, who had, really the first number one heavy metal album with Metal Health, and the big hit single, ironically, the cover song, Come On Feel the Noise, that the band didn't even want to record. They tried to sabotage that recording and, turn into a top 10 hit. And then, of course, Def Leppard had Pyromania in 83. This is a 10 million selling album. Again, a song like Photograph, a great example of what we're talking about here, of a hard rock song that had some melody, right, and was still accessible to radio. And then, later on, Rat, in 1984, from a style and an image standpoint, I mean, Rat was hair metal. There's no getting around it. Twisted Sister had the two big videos that made it into people's living rooms. You had Dokken and Wasp, and then, of course, Van Halen further in 1984. All this led up to the great explosion that happened in the mid 80s, really, that kind of started with Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. I mean, that was when it really broke the doors down to commercial success. I mean, that was just the huge crossover album after all this building through the first 5 years of the decade.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that in 1986, I was a freshman in high school. And Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet was huge. It was absolutely huge. Heard it everywhere. And yeah, that was definitely the point where everything really blew up. So let's talk about some of those bands that blew up around that time between 86 and 91.
Yeah, well, there's quite the host to choose from, right? Bon
Yeah.
Jovi was certainly probably first out of the gate. I mean, that album sold, I think, 12 million copies, and perhaps more importantly, at that point, the style of music started to become not only popular with, the angry, rebellious teen males, but the females got involved, right? They were happy to look at John Bon Jovi and to, sway to a song like Wanted Dead or Alive or Never Say Goodbye. So that really expanded the audience. You know, Poison launched their debut record at that time. Of course, it wasn't an instant hit, but as soon as MTV picked up Talk Dirty to Me, you know, here comes Poison. You know, in 1988, they had the big Open Up and Say Ah record. And again, of course, the power ballad, you know, launching them into the stratosphere, Every Rose Has Its Thorn. You know, 87 was huge because you had Hysteria and Appetite for Destruction. These are, you know, some of the biggest selling records in history for any genre. You know, 25 million copies of Hysteria, 30 million copies worldwide of Appetite for Destruction. These records didn't hit right away. Ironically, it took almost both of them a full year to simmer and hit. But when they did, I mean, there was just no going back. Whitesnake had the big 1987 album with the, you know, the videos that you could not see. Here I Go Again and Is This Love? Aerosmith finally had their proper comeback, you know, and they were probably bigger than they ever were with Permanent Vacation. And it just continued to spiral. By the time you got to 1989, this type of music was a dominant commercial force. Like today, you can never think that you would look back onto the Billboard chart and, you know, you look at the top 3 records and there's Bon Jovi and Poison and Def Leppard. You know, how can this be? But it was at the time. You know, Motley Crue put out their biggest commercial record, Dr. Feelgood, in 1989. You had Skid Row and Warren hit the scene then. You know, Aerosmith issued probably one of the best records of their career with Pump. And there were tons of new bands, right? Immediately you got a huge amount of bands that wanted to jump on the bandwagon, and all of them got lumped in with this category, although I'm not sure that's really fair or appropriate. But you had bands like Bang Tango and Britney Fox and Danger Danger and Extreme. You know, for better or worse, you know, Warren had the Cherry Pie album, which became synonymous with the genre. And so, I mean, it was huge. Unless you lived it, and I know we did, it's hard to relate to people how big this music really was, not just from a sales perspective, but culturally, right? I mean, it was just everywhere. The fashion, the style, the lifestyle.
Yeah, the fun.
The fun, yes. People forget, music and touring and bands used to be fun.
It used to be fun. Used to have big stage shows and lights. And well, I mean, they're doing that now again, but you know, for a while there with the grunge.
Yes.
Let's actually get into the grunge and what happened to all these bands when Nirvana came out. Because
Well, I mean,
I remember distinctively being in my bedroom and hearing Nirvana on the TV. Smells Like Teen Spirit. The music video was on MTV,
yeah.
and I started to hear the mumbles about this band. Like people were, you know, around me were starting to say, "Oh, this is going to be the next big thing," and I was total. You know, all my influences were, well, I mean, the early influences: Beatles, Zeppelin, Stones, all that, you know, the classic stuff. And then I had the 80s, right? And I was a guitar player, and Eddie Van Halen was my guy, you know, the best. Made me want to play guitar. TNT's Ronnie Latecro, another fantastic guitar player. Not really considered hair metal. Well, maybe they are. I'm gonna leave that one up to you. But yeah, just all these great influences came out. And then, you know, I was in a band and we were very close to getting a showcase with Arista Records at the time.
Wow.
And, yeah. And, you know, we were considered hair metal, right?
Of course.
You know, Enough's Enough had gotten signed out of Chicago in 88, I think. Their album
I remember
came
that
out.
was their label, yeah.
Yeah, in 89. And, you know, we were hoping to follow suit, sort of what happened in Seattle with the grunge. When Nirvana hit, everyone else got signed. We were hoping that Enough's Enough was going to hit huge, and then they were going to come to Chicago looking for other bands like them, and we were all set, you know. but it didn't happen. So you know, my story is nothing in comparison to the bands that were actually devastated by grunge when it came out at first. You couldn't give away like a new Motley Crue CD or something back then. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it was like,
oh yeah, I was there. Those CDs went straight to that bargain bin, right? You had Motley Crue self-titled, and you could see David Lee Roth's "Your Filthy Little Mouth." I mean, just like hundreds of copies. It was just terrible, heartbreaking.
Yeah. I mean,
I
these,
mean, it was really, when grunge came out, it was, unfortunately, it was game over. It was simple as that. And in hindsight, I mean, we like to say it happened overnight, like, in September of 1991, when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out. But we were there. It wasn't really overnight. I mean, it wasn't because it wasn't. In fact, I remember seeing Van Halen on tour in 1991, and Alice in Chains opened up for them. I mean, how could that be in retrospect, right? But at the time, it was all rock and roll, and we didn't know that we were going to have to choose between the two things.
yeah,
But it was almost overnight in the sense that I'm not sure there's any really genre of popular music in history that went from selling millions and millions of records just a couple years prior to just completely disregarded by the music industry and general public just almost immediately. I mean, maybe disco. I mean, that went out pretty quick.
yeah,
But other than that, I mean, it was complete, just out of fashion. And you're right. There's this popular phrase that grunge killed hair metal. More specifically, people will tell you that Nirvana killed hair metal. And there is certainly true sentiment to both of those things, but I'm not sure it's really the whole truth, right? I hate to say this, and it might not be a popular opinion, but hair metal was killing itself to some degree even before grunge hit, right? I mean, grunge might have been in the right place at the right time, but the hair metal market was starting to become admittedly extremely oversaturated. The demand and the supply equation was starting to become unbalanced. I mean, there was a ton of bands that came along, and trust me, I'm a huge fan of all these bands. But admittedly, they weren't reinventing the wheel. People like to call them copycat bands. I'm sure that's a little harsh. But bands like Firehouse and Trickster and Steelheart and Roxy Blue, Tora, Kick Tracy, Sweet FA, starting to get a little stale to some people. And the bands had already started to change their sound a little bit even before grunge. Poison did Flesh and Blood, which was still a party record, but it wasn't exactly, as, this is the wrong word, immature as their earlier records. Even
right.
Cherry Pie, aside from the single, Warrant was trying to move themselves in a slightly more serious direction, right? They had songs like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Song and Dance Man. Cinderella did Heartbreak Station, which was really kind of more of a country blues album. Skid Row had moved to Slave to the Grind, which wasn't really hair metal, right? This is almost a crushing heavy metal album.
Right.
Even the Guns N' Roses Use Your Illusion albums, not that Guns N' Roses was ever really hair metal, were kind of a different sound. But grunge was the tipping point, and to some extent, I'm not sure hair metal was really built to last on its own. These bands were living on 11, 12, 13. How long could they keep it up? Sure, you can keep it up when you're 20, 24 years old, but as you get into your 30s, I'm not so sure. And to some point, the 80s was all about bigger, extreme excess, more excess. At some point, how could you evolve, right? I mean, at some point, you couldn't play guitar any faster. You couldn't sing any higher. You couldn't party any harder, right? There was
Yeah.
nowhere for these bands to go. And when they did try to evolve, some of them beyond that, I'm not sure that the commercial public was ready for it. And I'm a horrible prime example, right? When Warren put out Dog Eat Dog in 1992, and there's a lot of people that will tell you that is Warren's best record. And maybe it is from a songwriting perspective and a musicianship perspective. But I was just, a dumb kid who wanted to hear the Down Boys, right? I didn't want to hear Andy Warhol was right or the Bitter Pill, and I was kind of disappointed.
Yeah.
So, people like myself wouldn't let them evolve even when they tried. But grunge was it, and grunge wasn't just it because the record industry shoved it down our throats. It was really, everything was changing, like I said, culturally, right? The 80s were about excess and big and bigger. I mean, the 90s weren't. Things were changing. The economy was in a different place. Socioeconomics were different. Politics were different. And a whole new generation of kids were different, right? There was a generation of kids that just couldn't relate to these big, extravagant, like you said, laser light shows and all the pyrotechnics. These kids were facing, a time that was more grim, more somber, and there had to be some kind of crash to accompany the high. I mean, the average American teenager couldn't relate anymore. They had very little interest in having nothing but a good time with Poison. They felt angst, they felt alienation, depression, and there was grunge music ready to swoop right in and satisfy all their needs. It just felt more real to them. If you were angry, if you were sad, if you were confused, and you want to embrace those feelings, grunge music allowed you to connect, right? Hair metal offered nothing along those lines. personally, I was seeking the exact opposite, right? I wanted to use music as escapism, right? I didn't need music to tell me that, things could be depressing and sad. I know that. I needed music to take me away. But people wanted to, relate to something. And, as a young kid, right, they might have appreciated these huge concerts and the huge spectacles that they were. But like I said, I don't think they could relate to them. Whereas the grunge bands, when they looked at this band on stage, well, this guy looked like them, he dressed like them, he seemed to have feelings like them. There was three chords that they could probably play in a garage. Not to say all grunge music is simple to play, but just immediately, and then despite all that, when MTV decided to just say, listen, there's no more hair metal, we're not about it, and it was just, you're completely gone, and we're going to embrace grunge and everything between the cultural aspect of it and the burnout on the music and the whole industry's discarding of it. I think you mentioned, it was tough for them. I mean, Motley Crue and Def Leppard and Poison were going to play stadiums this year. Those bands would have been lucky to play my backyard in 1995. It really
Yeah.
wasn't that bad. I mean, true fans know the music did not go away. A lot of these bands, sure, a lot of them broke up, but many did try and soldier on. Maybe tried to evolve, change their sound, and there was still records in the 90s. But if you were part of the average commercial consumer, you didn't know about it. For all intents and purposes, hair metal was extinct in the mid 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like, the term hair metal to me, it reminds me of tinfoil hat. When if you say something that may sound conspiracy related, people would go put on your tinfoil hat, and you just immediately get discluded from any serious conversation, right? It's kind of like that
Well,
same thing with hair metal, right?
yeah.
People just automatically dismiss it and they won't even give it a chance. But that was back in the day. It's different now. The kids nowadays, and as you were talking about, a lot of 80s bands coming back right before the pandemic hit, and they were going to tour, and they were going to draw big, and it was going to be great, right?
Well, you
So,
can never underestimate, nostalgia, right? For
right.
sure, for a lot of people. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like it was in the mid '90s. There was a couple of people have looked at the book, and maybe the more casual fans, and they said, okay, I'm looking at the title, The Rise, got it, The Fall, check, and then they get to the Rebirth part, and they say, I don't really remember the Rebirth part.
Right.
And to an extent, they're right. I mean, hair metal never came back to selling millions and millions of records very easily like that into a giant commercial force. And that's not what I'm talking about. But there was a legitimate resurrection and rebirth in, right around 1999, 2000, only to the relative extent that, it was so far down. But, at that point, grunge was basically gone. I mean, new metal and rap rock were in, and those styles weren't exactly in the hair metal family, but they were closer relatives than the black sheep that was grunge, right? The music still now possessed a renewed sense of energy and passion. And then again, you get to this cultural aspect of it, right? The economy started to flourish again. You had the dot-com bubble. And most importantly, I think you had nostalgia. People were coming of the age where they were ready to go to, the fairgrounds on a Friday or Saturday night. And, these people now working with families and they're, in their late 30s, and they're ready to, have a couple drinks and, hear 12 songs that define their youth and sing along and get a chance to relive their glory days again. And that's really where the reunion was felt was torn. And the bands discovered, they could package themselves up and make this a bigger thing. You had the Rock Never Stops tour, and Poison, Cinderella, Rat, and Warrant would get together. And then even the industry started to pick up on it, right? Because they'll go wherever the money is. You had VH1 did these behind the music specials right at the time. You had the Def Leppard show they did at the time in 2000 was one of the biggest episodes they ever aired. You had all kinds of greatest hit CDs come out. And tons of bands reunions, right? People were glad to get back together and tour. And even some of the music that these bands put out started to go back to the style that was in the 80s, right? Def Leppard did the, I'm not going to say grunge sounding, but more different sounding Slang in 1996. I was actually a big fan, for the record. But they did Euphoria right around that time, 1999, 2000. And that was really a return to the sound of Adrenalize. I mean, Motley Crue, of course, had the self-titled album, which also a huge fan of. And then they did the more grunge alternative sounding Generation Swine in 1997, not a huge fan of, for the record. But in 2000, they did New Tattoo, which, in my view, it was not a good album really, but the point was it got back to that guitar oriented, sleazy party rock that they, had cut their teeth on. Bon Jovi came out of hiatus again, right? In 2000, when they put out that Crush album, It's My Life was the third biggest single in the world, right? A whole new generation of fans discovered Bon Jovi. Poison got back together with CeCe DeVille, God bless them, and they did these big tours. Rat reunited, Great Right reunited, Skid Row with a new singer. Mr. Big got back together. So there was this resurgence. Even Whitesnake got together for that 25th anniversary tour at the time. And you could see it in culture too. I don't know if you've seen it, but right around that time, they did the movie Rockstar with Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So that was, and they actually did a pretty good job of depicting what hair metal was like in the 80s. But, there was, and since then, it's been 20 years since then, but, like I said, it's not back in its glory days, but at least as a platform for these bands to go out there and tour and make a living. Now, granted, there's not much money or any money to be had in making new music, unfortunately, anymore. But it's not like it was in the 90s when these bands were underground.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty crazy, man.
Yep.
Wow. I mean, just think if, like Poor Enough's Enough, right?
One of my favorite bands, and I'm sure I'm a huge fan of Donnie V. I just think he's one of the most talented and amazingly just gifted songwriters of our generation. Right? And I know I'm in the minority on that point, but that's my opinion, so I'm going to stand by it.
I'm with you 100%. I mean, he's an absolute genius.
Yeah.
They came out, in '89 and didn't really, start getting on MTV probably till, well, you probably know better than me, but it was towards the end. It was, the whole hair metal was winding down. They came out right at the end of it, got, grouped into the hair metal category.
Well, of course, look what their record label made them look like on that New Thing video.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that wasn't right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know whose fault that was. I'm guessing it was the label, and everyone was just kind of doing that at the time.
Right.
It was dead set with what was going on. It just came out about a year or two too late, because I think if they would have came out a little earlier, they would have been absolutely huge. One of the big bands like Crew and then that. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, just an immensely talented duo. Specifically, like you said, Donnie. I mean, they have songs and I don't know if I have all their records, of course, and I have all their demos, of course, all the ones I get my hands on. I don't know of any other band that has dozens and dozens and dozens of songs just sitting in the vault, that are unreleased and as good as anything, that were the big hits from this genre, or even the things they put on records. Just extremely prolific songwriters. And of course, Donnie V's solo career, I love the records, right? Just Enough and that the White Album he did, and most specifically, the recent one, Beautiful Things, where I think he finally, hit on the combination of the songs and the production, right? I know people don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on production. That Just Enough album he put out, of course, not to be critical, but parts of it sounded like demos a little bit, but the songs themselves, I just thought were amazing. Some of my favorite songs ever from a songwriting standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful Things was mixed and produced by Mike Tholen.
Yeah, it sounds like $1 million.
Yeah, he's great. He's one of the best, if not the best, at what he does. He's worked with all the legends. He does the some of the sound for the Matrix movies, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's the man. So really, and I was actually able to hang out for most of that album recording, and a lot of my instruments are on that album. So
no kidding.
Yeah.
Wow, what an honor.
My Hofner bass is on there. My Fender Strat, my acoustic, my Spectre bass, I think was on. It wasn't on the album, but it was on a single he released. So pretty cool. And I got to yell some things. I created a word. I came up with a word when Donnie was looking for a word for one of his songs. So that's kind of pretty involved on that. Not musically really, but I was hanging out and helping out, and
it's a beautiful thing. No pun intended. I remember when I first heard the record, I didn't read the liner notes or anything. I just popped it right in, and those opening guitar chords, I swear to you, I thought, that sounds a lot like Paul Gilbert. right? I'm
Yeah.
thinking, well, it can't be. And, it was. Paul
Yeah.
Gilbert, of course, one of my favorite guitarists, and he has this very distinct style of playing somehow. And you can recognize it straight out of the gate. But yeah, it's an amazing record. I can't listen to it enough.
Yeah. Paul Gilbert right away.
Yep.
You can't you can't turn that off, It's just, it's awesome. Do you have a favorite band?
Oh gosh, it's like asking somebody, who's your favorite child?
I know, right?
You can't answer the question.
How
But
about,
I will admit, as a young teenager growing up, it was Motley Crue for me all the way.
okay.
So even though I'm not a super huge fan of some of the steps they've taken later in their career, I'll stick with them through thick and thin. But I was just the biggest Motley Crue fan growing up, and still am for sure. But like I said, I hate to give them grief, but you still can't make me listen to Generation Swine. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
have hundreds of times, and I've tried to like it hundreds of times, and I just can't do it. But to each his own.
Yeah. When some of the 80s bands that we're talking about here tried to sound grunge to try to survive, I get it.
Yeah.
I probably would have done the same thing, but it just didn't work. It was not good for a lot
Well,
of them.
what always confused me about that was, you say I get it, and I do get it, right? Because first of all, I think there's some of these bands that involved, not necessarily trying to jump on a bandwagon. If they legitimately heard aspects of grunge and things like that, and they said, hey, this is something new that's influencing me, and I like it, I want to work into my material. I mean, gosh, hats off to them, right? Go where your heart goes. But I think there were, to your point, some that said, listen, I like what I'm doing, but I have to change to be relevant, right?
Yeah.
But what I never understood was how anybody, and this is not something that benefits, I think, exclusively from hindsight. I think even at the time, I don't know how anyone would have thought that would have worked, right? I mean, let's say Warrant put out the best grunge and alternative sounding album ever in the mid 90s. I mean, the grunge fans and the young kids, they weren't going to buy that because it said Warrant on it.
Yeah.
And the hair metal fans generally didn't like grunge and alternative music, right? So they weren't going to be happy with it. So these bands that were trying to change, I mean, if they were doing it just to try and stay relevant, I'm not sure they were serving any master, right? At least you stick to your guns if that's what's in your heart, and you satisfy the small number of fans you have left. But like I said, if they're doing it because it's what was, in their heads at the time, and I remember speaking to Jamie Lee at the time, and I'm not a huge fan of the sounds on Ultraphobic and Belly to Belly, although I think there's some great songwriting on there. But he really believed in that music, so more power to him, right? That's where he was trying to go, and that's where his heart was taking him. So and I'm happy to support him in that. But others that just tried to say, hey, I'm going to try and sound like this because I want to try and get on the radio. I don't know how they thought that could have worked.
Yeah. It was it was rough.
Yeah, I mean, but like I said, I mean, the record companies, I don't think had too much to do with it. I mean, in some cases, Vince Neil had that fantastic Exposed album in '93, but when it came time for him to do his follow-up, because mostly the record companies didn't care about these bands anymore, but the ones that were still involved in Warner Brothers at the time, when it came time to do Carved in Stone, they made him work with the Dust Brothers. And so, of course, the songs did not sound like hair metal anymore, but the record company said, you have to do this to stay relevant. Again, I'm not sure how they thought that could have worked, but or even Skid Row's Subhuman Race album. The producer at the time, I remember reading an article with Sebastian Bach where he said, hey, they were trying to force us in the grunge and alternative headspace. And, Sebastian Bach was this just terrific hair metal screamer.
Yeah.
And he was saying, well, the producer said, I don't want any screams on this album. Why can't you sing like Scott Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots? He doesn't have to scream. And I'm thinking, really? Did they think that was, going to work? But, you take an album like American Hardcore by LA Guns, they did that in the mid 90s. And, that of course sounds nothing like the LA Guns we knew from the 80s. But at the time, Tracy Guns and Steve Riley were huge into Pantera. And Tracy Guns said, I want to make a record that sounds like Pantera. And they did.
Yeah.
And, if that's what you're looking for, great. There's still a couple songs from that album that are on my gym playlist. But it didn't sound like Cocked and Loaded, did it?
No. I've got this show, and I'm actually interviewing a couple bands that, if they would have come out in the time period we're talking about, would have been labeled as hair metal. One of them is called the Midnight Devils, and the other one is Wild Street. Have you ever heard of either one of those bands?
The Midnight Devils, yes. I don't think so on Wild Street.
Those guys, these bands are coming back. People are, they're sick of not having fun, and this year, if 2020, well, last year I should say, if 2020 taught us anything, it's live while you can, because before we know it, we could be on another lockdown in another year or so, So I've had enough dark, depressing times. I want some fun back, I want shows. I want the people on stage to dress up at least a little bit, just don't look like you just came in from mowing the grass or, I mean, put a little effort, the grunge was great while it lasted. I was totally into it. It took me a while, but I came to respect all those bands.
Yeah.
Great musicians, and
Hmm.
it was the glam without the reverb on the drums and the echoey guitars with all the effects. It was just more like back with pure guitar right through amp, crank it to 10, and just strum and leave all the bad notes in and all that stuff. I mean, it was cool. It was a totally different thing, but I did eventually come around. But yeah, I mean, there were bands coming out that I think now it's a free for all. Like the generation of kids. I say kids. My daughter's 18, and she listens to all kinds of music, and so do all of her friends. Everyone she knows, they're not locked into just, I only listen to rock, I only listen to rap, I only listen to country. They like everything, and they don't care about the stigma. So if they see uh a Warrant song pop through their feed, they'll listen to it because they don't know. There, there's no hair metal stigma to that with them. They don't know. It's just music, and they like it. So
Yeah, I think they have it a little easier in some respects because they have a lot of avenues from which to experience music.
yeah,
In the '90s, and you knew what MTV told you pretty much, right? This was
true.
before largely an internet age, and what you had put in front of you as a consumer was what you bought. So the stigma might have been a little harder to avoid back then, but now you're right. People are free to make choices and to experience different things and not have any kind of preconceived notions that come with it. And yeah, you're right. There's certainly a whole lot of bands coming out and have been out, to be honest, that still embrace this sound.
Yeah,
Not necessarily in America, right? The majority, the safe haven for this kind of music is really overseas, specifically, in the Scandinavia area, right, where I have all these great bands. I don't know if hair metal is the right term, but certainly that style of music, the Reckless Love and Hardcore Superstar and Crazy Licks and Crash Diet and all these bands that really embrace this sound. I mean, here in America, the dominant commercially popular forms of music for the last 2 decades have really been, rap and country and pop.
yeah,
But I don't necessarily believe Gene Simmons so much when he tells us that rock is dead, right? I mean, I don't think it's ever dead. You just have to know where to look for it.
yeah, yeah. Definitely, it's not dead. There are so many great bands out there, like you said. You just got to find them. Um, Speaking of finding people, where can people find your book?
Oh gosh, they can find it at Amazon, The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal, or certainly the book's available, and there's some information at my website, www.hairmetalforever.com.
Christopher, thank you very much for coming on the show. Had a good time. I'll leave all those links in the description for everybody. And don't call it glam metal, people. Okay.
That's right. Don't
Just
let any of our heroes know we called it hair metal. Hey,
yeah,
Scott, I really appreciate the chance to be on the show and to speak with you. It's always so wonderful to hear from other fans, and specifically your background is super interesting to me. Keep in touch, please. I'd love to hear what you're up to, and future discussions would be great.
definitely. Come back anytime. And
All right. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
all right, Chris, take care.